And so, what is the role of a man in Australian culture versus the role of a woman? And how does that compare to the role of men and women in America? And what is an accepted norm for men and women in these cultures? Those are really important to tease apart the co-cultural influence that exists. Another thing to become more culturally aware and sensitive is asking questions, but then also listening effectively. And by doing those things, it reduces inaccurate information, stereotyping, and prejudice. That's pretty self-explanatory. Now, this is important in high context cultures, and we've talked about what those look like. But when we're asking questions and listening, it applies differently for those context cultures, whether they're high or low. So in a high context culture, be more cautious when communicating in initial conversations, because they are more likely to focus on nonverbal cues and more likely to make assumptions about others. So keep that in mind. If you're dealing with someone from a high context culture, the initial conversation is crucial. So be sensitive and cautious about that. In a low context culture, you need to pay attention to overt, obvious nonverbal expressions, but use self-disclosure and be more direct in asking for information. So very different in the way that you would approach a conversation. So another strategy for being more aware is creating a new culture. And this, again, is a very purposeful decision that you would make. But basically, the idea is that you're developing a third culture. And so, of course, it tends to be more on a case-by-case, situation-by-situation basis. But the idea is you establish common ground and establish relational empathy. So find things that you share and develop empathy with the person. And remember, what does empathy mean? I'm pretending I can hear all of you answer. Putting yourself in the other's shoes. So establish empathy with the person. What can you relate to? How can you understand them better? And recognize that you're coming from two different cultures. So you can permit varying degrees of understanding rather than requiring complete comprehension of the other's culture or emotions. And that's pretty, I would hope that's pretty intuitive. You recognize you're not always going to understand the other person. They're not always going to understand you. But you can establish common ground, you can establish empathy, and you don't have to require complete comprehension. There can be an agreement that we're not always going to relate and see eye to eye perfectly, but that's okay. Okay, so after we seek information, we have to be motivated. And here's another example of an American idiom: you gotta wanna. And no one else would know what that means if you have learned proper English as a second English speaker. Like that's your second language. That's not something that you're going to naturally understand, but that's true. You are going to have to make the decision to do it. And motivation is the state of readiness to respond to something. So it's not enough to just seek information. Once you have the information, you have to be ready to respond to it. There has to be action after you've sought the information. Attitude is everything. So if we're using a positive attitude, we will be more tolerant and more accepting of those who are different. And hopefully a positive attitude will help us to tolerate ambiguity about clarifying messages and behaviors. Sometimes even when we ask and even when we try to learn or understand, sometimes we may not. And that ambiguity can be frustrating. But if we have a positive attitude, we are accepting of that. And then another element is developing a mindfulness. So we need to be aware of cultural differences. It's not just that they exist, but we need to be aware of them. Consider the other person's frame of reference, or another way to say that is, what is their worldview? Often very different from American worldview. And we adapt our behavior to minimize cultural distortion. So be sensitive. If you're speaking with someone from another culture, be aware that there's going to be cultural distortion, so try to eliminate that, or at least change your overt behavior so that it won't be so confusing and difficult. And then use self-talk to manage emotions. And we've talked about how self-talk can be helpful. So, use that tool. Part of this whole journey for this class is adding more and more and more tools to your toolbox. So, sometimes I only address it in one specific chapter, but it's not to say that it can't carry over and be used in other instances. So in this one, we haven't talked about it in a cultural context, but self-talk is very helpful, because the alternative is our self-talk is negative. It's, oh my gosh, this person doesn't have a clue what I'm saying, or I have no idea what this person is trying to communicate to me, and it's so frustrating, and I'm asking questions and I'm not getting the right answers, and that's all negative self-talk. So use self-talk to manage your emotions. So talk about to yourself that acceptance, that tolerance, that mindfulness, all of those things. Avoid negative judgments. So we need to keep a positive attitude. Simultaneously, we need to avoid negative judgments. Be aware of our ethnocentrism. That's crucial. And that can become an underlying cause of mistrust and suspicion. If the impression is that you think you're better than someone, of course it's going to cause mistrust and suspicion and probably defensiveness. And so that can certainly become a compounding factor in the issue. And this is kind of a reframe, and I'm a counselor, so I'm all about reframing things. View differences as an interesting challenge, not an obstacle to be overcome. And that sounds simple, and it sounds kind of psychological, I suppose, but even in the words that we choose and the perception that we have changes a lot. So if we consider it a challenge, that's interesting. It is. It's something that requires some effort and some thought and some, time, but it's interesting and it's a challenge. And it's not necessarily an obstacle that we have to overcome or, accomplish some major task. Even in just that small shift in thinking, it can be a totally different experience. All right, so develop some skills. One of your number one go-to skills is flexibility. Responding skills are critical, but you need to be able to be flexible in those. Attention to nonverbal cues. Go back and review your nonverbal cues. Adjust communication style to help put the person at ease. And ideally, the other person would be affording you these things as well. So that's not to say that you're going to have to be the only one that's attempting these things in this interaction. The other person, hopefully, is trying to do the same things for you. And avoid questions or statements based on generalizations. Another important skill to have. Becoming other-oriented, we've talked a lot about that, but specific to culture, there's a concept of social decentering, which is a cognitive process, which means it requires your mind taking into account the other person's thoughts, feelings, values, background, and perspectives. So we are intentionally and cognitively putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. That's called social decentering, and that is part of becoming other-oriented. And then understanding based on how you responded when something similar happened to you. So try to remember when you've been in a situation like that and how, that has affected you. Understanding based on knowledge of a specific person. So maybe you've shared with someone in your life that, you're aware of some of the difficulties that they've had. So maybe that understanding came from a specific person in your life that has been able to be open and honest and share some of the difficulties of coming from another culture. And then understanding based on how you think most people would feel or behave. So kind of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. How would most people feel or behave, and is that the right thing? So okay, we've talked also about empathy versus sympathy, and I actually asked you to define that last time. So the official definitions: empathy, feeling what others feel or putting yourself in their shoes, versus sympathy, acknowledging, having compassion and understanding, parenthesis, knowing what they feel, close parenthesis. So Feeling what others feel is empathy. I literally can completely understand, and I have an awareness of what you are going through. Sympathy, you know what they feel, but you don't necessarily experience those feelings. So if you think about empathy versus sympathy in a cultural context, how might this difference affect communication interactions when there's intercultural communication taking place? That is some deep processing there, so give yourself a few minutes to consider that. Okay, so if we talk about adapting our communication, everyone adjusts their behavior to accommodate differences and expectations. Do you agree? And no matter what your answer to that question, how? In other words, if you say yes, everyone adjusts their behavior to accommodate differences and expectations, how does that take place? If you say no, everyone doesn't, okay? How does everyone not? What are examples where someone would not adjust their behavior to accommodate differences and expectations? Are we predictive or reactive in our communication? What do you think about that? In other words, are you anticipating an event or reacting to it once it's already taken place? And why would we adapt our messages? So, some more things to consider. Maybe to make them more understandable, to accomplish goals more effectively. You tell me what you think. Okay, so the main activity for the week, we're going to solve the problems of the world. That's what counselors do, right? Okay, so we're going to try to resolve cultural challenges. And this is normally done in a classroom setting, so it's going to be more of an individual type of approach this time rather than working in groups, which that's okay because we're individualistic in our culture, right? So what we're going to do is, in addition to the reflection post this week, choose one of the following 6 case studies and address the problem that's presented from a culturally competent perspective. So reflect on something from the lecture or something from the book, or thoughts or questions that you've had as a result of either. And then this is your main activity for the week. So I'm going to go through the next 6 case studies. You can choose whichever one you like the best or you think you have the most insight into or whatever. And you will answer the question for the one you choose. So let's go ahead and go through them. Case 1. Your team has been assigned to greet a delegation of visitors from Japan. The particular group you will meet is very traditional in behavior. Touch is strongly avoided and considered to be very rude. No is not used. Women generally play a subservient role and avoid direct eye contact when conversing with men. It is a high context culture that typically attempts to avoid uncertainty. So, hint, hint. High context culture, important to note. Avoidance of uncertainty, also important to note. So, go back and look at those slides if you need a refresher. So the problem is, your male supervisor has been delayed and will not be able to meet the group for an hour. Your remaining group is all female. Case 1. How do you handle that? Case 2. Your sales team has been assigned to renew an annual contract with a vendor. The vendor has a reputation for being very demanding and holds the expectation of being wined and dined when discussing business. His preferences include going to gentlemen's clubs for entertainment. The problem is, your group is mixed gendered and the most knowledgeable salesperson is one of the females. What will you do in this circumstance? Case 3. You are to greet a group of Saudi Arabian investors who are interested in investing a significant amount of money in one of your corporation's projects. Saudi custom is to stand face to face with a friend so that less than 6 inches of distance separates one another. In addition, it is a high context culture, ding, 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 where nonverbal communication is more important than verbal messages.